I'ma do you like baby them did me. Yeah. I'll never forget that day. Yeah, they was all in the kitchen. I was scared. It was cool. There was about this many it took in that bit. I'll never forget the word. Suck Lil Wayne, let.
There are moments preserved on record that remain difficult to revisit, not because of what is clearly stated, but because of what is implied. In later years, Lil Wayne would recount an early experience from his childhood in language that suggested fear, confusion, and vulnerability at an age when none of those things should have been part of a child's world. The account has circulated quietly for years, often referenced rather than replayed, its weight carried less by detail than by the silence that follows it. What matters is not the exact words, but the age at which they were spoken about, and the fact that they were spoken at all. That recollection is not presented as an isolated moment. Those who study Wayne's rise often point to it as an early fracture in a larger story, a childhood shaped by opportunity, control, and exposure long before consent or understanding could reasonably exist. His ascent came with undeniable success, but also with a cost that would only become visible much later. To understand how this began, it is necessary to step back, before the fame, before the acclaim, before the mythology. Before he was celebrated as one of the most influential artists of his generation, Dwayne Michael Carter Jr. was a child growing up in Hollygrove, New Orleans. It was a city rich in culture and creativity, but also marked by instability, violence, and systemic neglect. His biological father was absent early in his life, leaving a void that many children carry quietly and indefinitely. His mother did what she could within the limits of her circumstances, raising a gifted son in an environment that offered few protections and even fewer guarantees. In the early 1990s, Brian Williams, known publicly as Birdman, entered that world. He was already establishing himself as a powerful figure in the local music scene, projecting wealth, confidence, and access. To a child with rare talent, and to a parent searching for a path forward, his presence represented possibility. In a city where survival itself was uncertain, an offer of structure, mentorship, and escape could easily appear as salvation. Wayne was still in elementary school when he was brought into Cash Money Records. An age when most children are insulated from adult pressures, he was instead immersed in an industry governed by money, loyalty, and hierarchy. The formation of the Hot Boys followed soon after, placing him among older teenagers and adults, all operating within a system that rewarded productivity far more than protection. Publicly, the relationship between Birdman and Wayne was framed as familial. Birdman repeatedly referred to Wayne as his son, and at times claimed to have formally adopted him, though no documentation has ever surfaced to confirm that claim. Whether legal or symbolic, the assertion carried weight. It positioned Birdman not merely as a business partner or mentor, but as a parental figure beyond scrutiny. Questioning the relationship became, in effect, questioning a family bond. Wayne embraced that identity completely. He echoed the language, internalized the role, and permanently marked his body in tribute. He distanced himself from his biological father, speaking openly years later about the absence he felt and the emotional severance that followed. By his own account, his sense of fatherhood had been transferred entirely. The attachment was total. It is here that unease begins to surface, not through accusation, but through pattern. Observers, critics, and psychologists have long noted how vulnerability can be shaped by dependency, especially when a child's emotional needs are met alongside professional obligation. The line between care and control becomes difficult to define, particularly when one party holds authority over housing, income, and identity itself. Over the years, moments captured publicly added to that discomfort. Displays of physical affection between Birdman and Wayne, documented in interviews, award shows, and promotional appearances, prompted questions that many felt reluctant to voice. These were not private allegations or second-hand rumors. They were moments seen by audiences, replayed, debated, and often dismissed without resolution. When asked to explain them, Birdman framed his actions as paternal instinct shaped by a dangerous environment, a reflection of life in the streets, where tomorrow is never promised. On the surface, the explanation resonated with a familiar logic of survival and closeness. But context matters, and when viewed alongside the broader power imbalance, the explanation did not quiet concerns so much as deepen them. Others who passed through the same spaces noticed the same dynamic. Years later, artists who had been around Cash Money during that period acknowledged witnessing these interactions themselves. Their accounts were measured, not sensational. They did not expand on motives or intent. They simply confirmed what had already been visible. What remains unsettled is not a single moment or gesture, but the cumulative effect of years lived without boundaries clearly defined. A child raised inside an adult world. A bond that blurred personal, professional, and emotional lines. A legacy built on brilliance, shadowed by questions that were never fully addressed. This story endures not because it offers easy conclusions, but because it does not. It lingers in the spaces where certainty should exist and does not, where silence replaces answers, and where success cannot erase the cost of what may have been taken long before anyone was watching. What makes certain testimonies impossible to dismiss is not their volume, but their precision. When individuals who moved within the same space describe what they did not see as much as what they did, the contrast becomes revealing. One observer noted that the behavior in question was never directed toward other artists in the same circle. It was not something extended broadly, nor was it a consistent expression of affection across the roster. According to those accounts, it appeared limited, focused, and unusually specific. That distinction matters. It shifts the discussion away from cultural misunderstanding and toward a pattern that demands closer examination. Other witnesses, speaking years later, described moments they personally found unsettling at the time. Their language was restrained, their recollections brief, and their conclusions cautious. They did not speculate about intent. They simply described what they had seen and how it diverged from anything they recognized as appropriate. One artist, when asked directly, said he found the behavior strange even then. The consistency across these accounts, different voices, different moments, the same discomfort, has kept the questions alive long after the events themselves passed. Lil Wayne himself eventually addressed the subject through his art, referencing it obliquely, almost defensively. Whether that was an act of reclaiming control over his narrative or an attempt to normalize what he had been conditioned to accept remains unclear. Trauma often resists clean interpretation. Survivors do not always speak in the language outsiders expect. Sometimes they minimize.
But he said, yeah, I mean, that was actually happening. Did you ever see that?
Yeah. I mean, baby never played with me like that. Don't let me clear that up. You understand what I'm saying? I never seen baby play with Juvenile like.
Sometimes they deflect. Sometimes they protect the very structures that shaped them, because acknowledging harm would require dismantling the foundation of their own identity. As the story deepens, it moves beyond public moments and into recollections from Wayne's childhood at Cash Money, memories he chose to share on camera, without prompting, years later. He spoke of an incident from that time with a tone that was conflicted, describing fear alongside casual dismissal. He was very young. The adults around him were not. What he recalled suggested an environment where boundaries were absent and where experiences no child should have been exposed to were treated as ordinary, even formative. The way Wayne spoke about it, publicly, almost conversationally, added another layer of unease. It did not sound like a confession seeking sympathy. It sounded like someone recounting something that had long ago been absorbed into his understanding of how the world worked. That normalization is often one of the most lasting consequences of early trauma. When harm is introduced without language to name it, it becomes difficult to recognize later, even harder to challenge. In subsequent years, Wayne would acknowledge the psychological toll of his childhood in broader terms, connecting early experiences to long-term mental health struggles. He spoke of pain that followed him into adolescence, of coping mechanisms that formed early and stayed long. Observers have long noted how often unprocessed trauma manifests through self-destruction, through risk, dependency, or emotional withdrawal. Wayne's battles with addiction and instability have been widely documented, and he himself has pointed back to his earliest years in the industry as a turning point. Taken together, the timeline is difficult to ignore. A child immersed in an adult world, experiences framed as initiation rather than harm, emotional attachment tied to survival and success, and, not long after, visible signs of psychological fracture. None of this proves intent, but it does suggest consequence. What complicates the story further are other allegations that surfaced around the same environment over the years, involving different young artists and similar concerns. Each account stands on its own, unproven and contested, yet when viewed collectively, they form a troubling outline. Young boys from vulnerable backgrounds, drawn into a system that offered opportunity while erasing boundaries, where mentorship and control were often indistinguishable. Some commentators have noted that this pattern is not unique to one label or one city. Across the entertainment industry, there are histories where exploitation has been reframed as preparation, where harm has been justified as toughness, and where silence has been mistaken for consent. These narratives persist precisely because they are difficult to confront without unraveling success stories many would rather leave intact. Years later, in his own writing, Wayne made a quiet but significant shift. He distanced himself from the man he had once publicly called family, stating plainly that the bond he had claimed for so long no longer existed. There was no explanation, no accusation, no elaboration. Just a line drawn where there had once been complete allegiance. For someone who had built his identity around that relationship, the distance spoke louder than any detailed account ever could. What remains is not a single allegation or moment, but a portrait of a childhood spent without protection, inside a system that rewarded silence and resilience over safety. Wayne's legacy as an artist is unquestioned, but beneath that legacy lies a human story marked by confusion, dependency, and consequences that followed him into adulthood. It is a reminder that success does not erase harm, and that some costs are paid long after the applause fades. How do you reconcile a life shaped by contradiction, when the person who provided wealth, protection, and opportunity is also the figure associated with experiences that can never be undone? How do you learn to separate gratitude from harm when the two were delivered together, deliberately intertwined? And how does anyone begin to name abuse when doing so threatens to unravel the very identity, career, and success that made survival possible in the first place? This unresolved tension runs through Lil Wayne's career like a low, persistent hum. It surfaces in his music through themes of isolation, emotional numbness, dependency, and pain, threads that trace back to his earliest years in the industry. Once recognized, they are difficult to unhear. They suggest an inner life shaped as much by endurance as by triumph. Eventually, the private contradictions gave way to a public reckoning. The relationship between Wayne and Birdman did not exist solely in the realm of personal history. It was also bound up in business, ownership, and power. What had long been presented as a familial bond collapsed under the weight of unresolved disputes that were no longer confined to silence. In 2014, Wayne publicly described himself as trapped, unable to release his long-awaited album because of conflicts with Cash Money Records. The language was stark. For an artist who had generated immense value for the label, who had helped build its global reputation and elevate its most successful acts, the claim carried a bitter irony. The empire he helped create had become the barrier to his own work. The following year, that conflict moved into the legal system. Wayne filed a lawsuit seeking tens of millions of dollars, alleging widespread financial mismanagement and diversion of profits connected to Young Money, the label he founded. At the center of the dispute were questions of ownership, transparency, and control, questions that, according to the filings, had gone unanswered despite the enormous revenue generated during that period. The accusations extended beyond a single individual, naming corporate structures and partnerships that Wayne claimed had failed to account for his stake in the business he helped sustain. As the legal battle unfolded, the personal rupture became undeniable. Wayne spoke openly of betrayal, no longer using the language of family but of harm. In interviews and music, he framed the conflict not as a disagreement, but as abuse, an intentional choice of words that marked a profound shift in how he understood his past. Tensions escalated beyond contracts and courtrooms. Public confrontations followed, and incidents occurred that underscored how volatile the situation had become. What had once been marketed as an unbreakable bond now appeared fractured beyond recognition, its breakdown watched closely by an industry familiar with such implosions. At the same time, other artists began to speak, some recalling their own disputes with Cash Money over unpaid earnings and opaque accounting. Their stories differed in detail but echoed similar concerns. Taken together, they suggested a pattern of business practices that mirrored, in structure if not in form, the personal imbalances Wayne had long navigated. In 2018, after years of conflict, a settlement was reached. The specifics were not fully disclosed, but the outcome was clear. Wayne was released from his contractual constraints, received compensation, and regained control over his music. Shortly afterward, he released the album that had been delayed for years. Critics described it as a statement of survival, an artist asserting authorship over his voice after decades of struggle. Publicly, gestures of reconciliation followed. Apologies were issued, performances were shared, Familiar language resurfaced. Yet reconciliation does not erase history. Public unity does not dissolve private reckoning. What Wayne had described in earlier years, in interviews, in music, in moments captured on camera, remained part of the record. The legacy, then, is not a clean resolution but an uneasy coexistence of success and consequence. A reminder that artistic triumph can rise from deeply compromised beginnings, and that survival, even when visible to millions, often carries wounds that applause cannot heal. The existence of reconciliation does not erase a record. Patterns observed by multiple, independent witnesses do not dissolve because of a shared stage or a public embrace. Allegations documented in court filings do not lose their weight simply because time has passed. What remains is evidence, visible, recorded, and enduring. In recent years, the conversation surrounding Lil Wayne and Birdman has returned with renewed intensity, shaped by a broader cultural awareness and a willingness to revisit what was once overlooked.